Richard Sandler is an American internationally renowned and iconic street photographer, documentary filmmaker, and photography curator. He was awarded a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship for filmmaking in 2006 and 2 foundations for the Arts Fellowship in photography in 1992 and 1998. Called by Time magazine as the unsung street photographer of the 1980s New York, Sandler captured the uncapturable and documented the people of New York in a pre-social media era where such raw documentation and representation was and still is radical. Following a generation of street photography that carried the likes of Diane Arbus, Gary Winogrand, and Lee Friedlander, Sandler's works capture the streets of New York with new sensitivities to ever-changing times. Sandler's photographs are in the permanent collections of Brooklyn Museum, Center for Creative Photography, the University of Arizona, Houston Museum of Fine Art, Museum of the City of New York Historical Society, and New York Public Library. And I have the delight of talking with him today. Welcome, Richard. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me on behalf of Uncontaminated.
Very good. Thank you.
And you're calling us from New York?
From New York State, not New York City, about 100 miles north of New York City.
Okay, great. Nice. I'm curious as to how your upbringing and how your childhood and your experience kind of being a teenager in New York at that time influenced your practice.
Well, I was born into a TV family. A TV and radio family. Actually, radio and TV is a better way to say it. My mother was an actress, professional actress. She was trained as a Shakespearean actress, and then she made her money in later years as a doing radio programs on radio before television, and then when television happened, she was on early television shows that were broadcast from New York. And then she went on to make her living doing voiceovers for TV commercials and such after she had kids. But anyway, my mother exposed me to art. My mother and my godmother exposed me to art by taking me to the Museum of Modern Art when I was a really young kid, like around 1952, 53, 6, 7, and they took me to see the Monet exhibit, the exhibit of the water lilies of Monet. Mm-hmm. And I remember so clearly seeing that at that age and how it impressed me, how deeply it impressed me. And though I did not go directly into the arts, I was a chef in macrobiotic restaurants and was very involved in the beginning of the natural foods movement in the United States first. And then later I trained as an acupuncturist in England. Mm-hmm. I went to school in Warwickshire. Mm-hmm. Warwickshire. I said that correctly, correct? Yes. Not Warwickshire. So I got my degree and had a license to practice in the UK and in the Commonwealth countries, and then came back to the United States and practiced acupuncture for, I guess around 7 or 8 years. And then I got bit by the photography bug. When I got into photography, I eventually, initially I was practicing acupuncture and doing photography, and then photography just became too strong for me, and I had to let go of practicing acupuncture and started to make my living now as a photojournalist working for newspapers and magazines, first in Boston and then in New York City, working for the New York Times as a freelancer. And that led to many other associations with other magazines and newspapers. So acupuncture was now, in my rearview mirror. I stopped practicing. Mm-hmm. And I suppose I have continued on that path since then. I've certainly become very much involved in video making and filmmaking. And that is pretty much my practice now. I'm always carrying my still camera with me, and I shoot every day, even up here in the country that I live in the country mostly, and I still am shooting all the time, even if it's landscapes or cityscapes or whatever you want to say. I'm not really photographing on the street so much, because the streets around where I live are pretty dead. There's not a lot of action.
Yeah.
And I need a lot of action, as a street photographer. But I feel like I've made the pictures that I wanted to make. I've made the street pictures that I wanted to make. I don't feel like, I have a lot of things yet to do as a street photographer. I'm very content to finish my creative life as a filmmaker.
I saw some of your films, in particular Martha's Vineyard. I think that was like like a motion kind of picture. Really, really beautiful, of the ocean. And there was several others. There was also one, Radioactive, which was like a video of the city, but it kind of felt like rendered in a similar way that you'd render like a landscape. So I thought that was interesting too, kind of like, yeah, I wonder if there's kind of like a bridge between that, and if there can be, between street photography, photographing people on the street, and then moving more towards film and photographing like nature and kind of more natural things, or perhaps not. I'm just curious. Yeah, your thoughts.
Well, the filming of nature is being done in the service of telling a story about a particular Native American tribe on the island of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. So this is a documentary. It's not finished yet. That is to say, it's not edited yet, but it's mostly shot. And so it was a different project. It's a completely different project. I like doing different things. I get bored after a while. With photography, I felt like I did what I wanted to do. So I felt very clear-minded about changing gears.
Yeah.
And I got very into filmmaking. And the documentaries that I made on video in New York City, The Gods of Times Square, Brave New York, and Sway, they are about Times Square, the East Village, and the New York City subway system, followed. And I had my still camera with me, but I did not use it that much. But I always had it with me, but I didn't use it that much. I put it too on the back burner.
Yeah.
So I got into video in 1992. And I shot video like crazy until 2001. And then when 9/11 happened in New York, I pretty much stopped photographing, but never completely. But I was mainly shooting video because the sound of what was going on the street after 9/11 was more important and more germane to documentation than was still photography, because it had sound, and you needed to hear what people were saying and crying and arguing and just mourning the horror of 9/11. And so I recorded that on video and with sound, of course.
Especially just sort of taking that shift and adapting as well to the street and to the people of the street too. Like, it feels like a very in sync and intuitive relationship, like the art that you have and the art that you do, and your subjects and your surroundings, the way that you kind of approach that shift. I'm also curious if you have different processes when shooting people, or when kind of doing documentaries, or if it's more of a landscape. Is your process different at all? I mean, obviously we understand it's different in terms of like reacting to what's going on in the outside world with your shift from 9/11. But are there any other differences in your processes?
Well, in still photography, you make a picture and you move. I mean, the way I do it, I make a picture and I move on.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not out there to talk to people particularly or make friends or enemies. I'm just seeing an instant, a moment. And once it's been, recorded, I'm gone. But with video, particularly video, I'm talking to people. I'm stopped. We're having a conversation. I'm recording the conversation. And beyond that, I'm also recording the sounds of Times Square, the sounds of the subway, the sounds of the East Village. So it's a completely different process. There couldn't be, they both share the reality of the frame itself. In both cases, I'm framing, but in one case, I'm moving on, and in the video case and film case, I have to stick around. It happens in time. Still photography is an instant, and video and film happen in real time.
And is there a favorite series that you're most proud of, whether it is in video, film, or photography?
Well, the trilogy, I guess, that I made in New York of The Gods of Times Square,
Mm-hmm.
Brave New York, about the East Village, and Sway, about the New York City subway system. I'm very proud of those. I think I documented the streets of New York again, and the subways of New York again, and did it reasonably well, I think. At least I'm very satisfied with what I did. And in terms of filmmaking, that is to say, the films that I've made, shot on film, I'm still learning. That's another whole lifetime study, becoming a filmmaker. It's very different. And luckily I have very dear friends who have mentored me in all of those pursuits of mine. As a still photographer, I took a weekend workshop with Gary Winogrand in 1977, and that completely blew my mind. And I think I learned everything that I need to know about how to comport myself as a street photographer just by watching him. He was so articulate, and I really, really, vibed into Winogrand. As a still photographer. As a videographer, a dear friend of mine named Stephen Hirsch taught me the ins and outs of video in 1992 when I started. And then as a filmmaker, I've had a great mentor and a great cinematographer named Frankie DeMarco, who's shot a lot of famous movies.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's wonderful as well that you have like such an interesting progression like throughout your career, and it all seems like it's flowed very intuitively and progressed really, really wonderfully. I'm also curious about the two works that you have with Uncontaminated that are going to be available as NFTs. So Grand Central Terminal and Subway Noir. Is there a specific reason why you chose these works?
They were both pictures that really, shall we say, energized me creatively. As a still photographer, you never really sure, if you're shooting film, you're never really sure how something is going to translate. 100%, you're never really sure. I should say digital photographers don't have that problem because they can just look immediately. But I don't shoot digital. I only shoot film. I don't shoot digital stills, with the still digital still camera. So I was pretty blown away by those two pictures, and in the first case, the Grand Central 1990 Grand Central Terminal 1990 picture, Um, I shot a bunch of rolls of film. I think I might have shot 4 or 5 rolls of film. I knew there was pictures there, but it was very hard to get because there's so many people moving, and it's impossible to, be fast enough to orchestrate it. I just shot a lot and hoped for the best. There was a little bit of luck involved, but when I saw that guy with the hat be the sort of coalescing, structural and subject matter moment, I jumped all over it, and I was really happy when I developed that film and saw that picture.
Even the lighting in that picture is like beautiful, and I love how it's like so kind of, it's obviously in like such a usually like busy place, but it still feels like almost a isolated and like lonely stance at the same time. And I think it's really beautiful. I mean, it almost seems like with the light kind of coming down, like it could even be compared to like a religious, like iconographic piece, the way that it's kind of.
Yeah, I know. I feel that way too. And believe me, I feel fortunate. I'm not braggadocious about that picture at all. I did try to make that kind of a photograph, but it exceeded my wildest dreams. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes in a situation like that, a lot of it is not in your control, but I still had, enough of a grasp of what was going on in that whole frame. And, there are elements of it I can, lay claim to, positioning of people within the frame. But anyway, the other one is completely different. That man was sitting on the subway train, the Subway Noir picture. That man was sitting in a subway carriage, you say, and that most of the lights were out, and the only light that was on, the trains were really messed up in those days. I mean, a lot of the time the lights would be out in the car, sometimes completely out. You would get into a train car that had no lights at rush hour, and there's 100 people in the car, and there's no lights. Sometimes you couldn't even see out of the windows because the graffiti writers and painters of the cars would paint over the windows themselves. And sometimes the intercom within the trains was broken too. So you didn't know where you were if you were in one of those cars. Anyway, in this case, the lights were out in this car that this man was sitting in reading the paper. Except there was one light on above his head. There was one small bank of fluorescent lights that were on above his head, and it is illuminating the newspaper, and the light from the newspaper is reflecting onto his face. So it was like a white card, the kind of thing you do in the studio. And I'm shooting at a slow shutter speed. I'm probably shooting at an 1/8 of a second or a 15th of a second. So if he was moving, or if there was any move, the car was stopped. So I lucked out on that one too. But there is skill involved for sure in shooting at those slow shutter speeds. And one of the tricks is to hold your own breath.
Looking at these images as well, they really do kind of represent that notion of being in a big city with like hundreds and thousands of people, yet still feeling somewhat alone and isolated. And this is obviously like an experience that feels very much, generalized and experienced as like a collective, especially nowadays that we have, social media and other things. But I think you've beautifully captured this notion of being surrounded and being amongst other people, yet still being somehow kind of isolated and in solitude. And both these images together actually really encapsulate that wonderfully. Well, that brings me to my final point. Just wondering if there's anything else exciting that's upcoming that you wish to share. I mean, obviously there's that, which is really amazing, and congratulations.
For the last 6 years, I have been harvesting my archive. I have been in the darkroom 3-4 nights a week. I mean, I'm actually more involved in producing photographs than in any other time in my whole life as a photographer. And I have the photographs for a second book. My first book, The Eyes of the City, is out. Unfortunately, it's now out of print after selling out of 2 printings, and I'm hoping that the publisher will reprint it for the 3rd time. But beyond that, I have gone through my entire archive and have come up with, a couple of 100 photographs that I'm going to edit down to 100 maybe, and produce a second book. So I'm very excited. I'm very excited about that.
Do you have a title for that yet, or is that still?
Well, there's a working title, and it's by no means set in stone. But it's called, the working title is Second Eyes.
Okay, great. So you have
because I am looking at the work with new eyes. And I looked at everything, literally, that I ever shot on the street, thousands of rolls of film, one by one and frame by frame, and came up with so many images that I had either overlooked or rejected in the past for one misguided reason or another. In some cases, very misguided, because I missed a bunch. I probably missed 50 pictures that easily could have been in my first book, if not 100. And so I'm looking forward to that. That's a big thing. And the other thing that I'm looking forward to is curating a major street photography show of Los Angeles only street photography. I've been working on this for a couple of years since I had a show in Los Angeles and was there for a good spell. I got the idea to create a Los Angeles only street photography show. And Los Angeles has a very, very different history of street photography than New York or Chicago or Philadelphia or any of the other cities in the United States, because Los Angeles is so big and there's not really very much of a street photography community there. Everybody is kind of a lone wolf, and LA is a very, very, very distancing town. It's kind of a lonely place, really, because there's very few people on the street. There are people on the street in downtown LA, but in the rest of Los Angeles, which is Los Angeles County, in other words, the county of Los Angeles is the same as the city. So all of the pictures taken in Los Angeles County over 65 or 70 years would be in play for such a show. And so this would be a museum show. This would not be a gallery show, because there'll be Robert Franks in it, there'll be Gary Winogrand's in it, there'll be Lee Friedlander's in it. And so what I need for this is a museum venue and, a top flight one. So that's something that I'm working on, that I'm very excited about, and I hope it comes to pass. I have previously curated, I should say, a major street photography show in New York City in 1997 into 98 called Living for the City, 20 years of New York street photography. And it had, some wonderful photographers in it: Jeffrey Mermelstein, Arlene Gottfried, Sylvia Plahy, Sid Kaplan. I don't know how many of these names are familiar to you or not, but it was a wonderful show. And so I got the taste for curating. You mentioned earlier that I'm, a part-time, sometime photography curator, and I've really got that going again right now, because I'm very high on trying to get this LA show mounted.
When are you looking at, like, the dates?
Well,
you're still early stages, but
yeah, I'm still early stages, but I will be in Los Angeles in about 4 months, and I'll be working with my editor, who lives about 70 miles from Los Angeles, on the film, the Martha's Vineyard film that I talked about. We'll be working on that. And so I'll be within striking distance of Los Angeles, and we'll be hopefully, finding a museum venue that will take the show in hopefully not too long of a period of time. And I'm trying to get this into museums, that have bookings, 3 to 5 years in advance.
Yeah.
LACMA and Getty and
Mm.
Hammer Museum, such like that. And so we'll see.
Yeah, well, that would be amazing. And thank you so much for your time. This has been really
You're very welcome.
You're
very welcome.
it.
Thank you for being an excellent interviewer.
Thank you so much, Richard.
You're very welcome.